Welcome back to comfy sleeping. Get comfortable now. Let your body sink into the bed. Let your eyes close, even if you keep listening for a while yet. Tonight, we're going to visit a quiet Roman town on the Bay of Naples. A town of bakeries and bathhouses, gardens and gossip, going about an entirely ordinary day. Until the mountain beside it changed everything, and, in doing so, accidentally preserved that very ordinary day for us to still see, almost 2,000 years later. We'll move slowly through it, the way the ash itself settled, unhurried, layer by layer. There's no need to remember any of it. Just let it drift past you, soft and quiet, like dust settling after a long day. Picture Pompeii on an ordinary late summer morning. Sunlight on painted courtyard walls, the smell of fresh bread drifting from a corner bakery, cartwheels rattling faintly over stone-paved streets, and beyond the rooftops, quiet and unremarkable against the blue sky, a green, forested mountain that nobody in the town thought to call a volcano at all. That's where tonight's story begins. On a morning like any other, in a town that had no idea it was about to become one of history's most famous places. Chapter 1: A town like any other. Pompeii, in the decades before its destruction, was a prosperous, unremarkable Roman town on the Bay of Naples, home to somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people. According to modern archaeological estimates, a genuine, ordinary Roman community rather than any place of particular historical significance at the time. Pompeii's origins actually predate direct Roman control by several centuries, having first been settled by the Oscan people, an indigenous Italic population, before passing through periods of Greek and Samnite influence, and finally becoming a Roman colony in the early 1st century BCE. After briefly siding against Rome during a regional Italian revolt and suffering a Roman military siege as a direct consequence. The town had grown wealthy through trade, agriculture, and its pleasant coastal location, popular enough as a getaway that wealthy Romans, including figures connected to the imperial family, kept villas nearby. Its streets held bakeries, laundries, taverns, bathhouses, a large forum, temples, and a substantial amphitheater. The everyday infrastructure of a thoroughly ordinary, thoroughly Roman provincial town. Pompeii's harbor, connected to the sea by the Sarno River, made it a genuinely significant regional trading hub, importing and exporting goods across the wider Mediterranean, though the exact ancient coastline has since shifted considerably, with the modern shoreline now sitting a noticeable distance further from the excavated town than it stood in the 1st century CE. A slow geological change entirely separate from, but sometimes confused with, the town's more sudden, dramatic destruction centuries later. Nothing about Pompeii's location seemed unusual or dangerous to the people living there. The mountain that loomed over the town, covered in vineyards and forest, hadn't erupted in living memory, or, as far as anyone at the time knew, in any memory at all. The Romans didn't even have a specific word for volcano, as we understand it, and had no meaningful framework for understanding what Vesuvius actually was, or what it was quietly capable of. Pompeii's streets followed a grid pattern typical of planned Roman towns, with raised stepping stones at intersections, allowing pedestrians to cross without stepping directly into the street itself, which regularly flooded with water and waste. A small, practical detail of urban design that also, conveniently for chariot and cart traffic, was spaced to allow wheels to pass through on either side, an ancient solution to a genuinely ordinary urban problem, still recognizable to any modern city planner. The town's forum, at its civic and religious heart, was lined with temples, government buildings, and covered market halls, serving as the focal point for public life, much as it did in every other Roman town of the era. Surrounding streets held everything from modest single-room shops to grand private homes built around open central courtyards, their walls decorated with the vivid painted frescoes that would later make Pompeii so valuable to art historians. Chapter 2: The Mountain Nobody Worried About. Mount Vesuvius, standing a little over 4,000 feet, had last erupted catastrophically many centuries before Pompeii's founding. So far in the past that no written or oral memory of any previous eruption survived into the Roman period at all. Modern geological study has revealed that Vesuvius's fertile volcanic soil, ironically, was part of what made the surrounding region so agriculturally rich and desirable to settle in the first place. The very same volcanic activity that would eventually destroy Pompeii had, over previous centuries, helped create the productive vineyards and farmland that made the region prosperous enough to build a town like Pompeii there at all. This pattern, dangerous volcanic soil, also being unusually fertile soil, isn't unique to Vesuvius. It appears near active and dormant volcanoes across the world, from Italy to Indonesia to Central America, drawing farming communities to settle in genuinely dangerous locations across human history, precisely because the same underlying geological forces that create earthquakes and eruptions also, over centuries, enrich the surrounding soil in ways ordinary farmland rarely matches. There had been warning signs in the years immediately before the eruption, though nobody at the time correctly interpreted them. A serious earthquake struck the region in 62 CE, causing significant damage across Pompeii and neighboring towns, damage that was still being repaired in some buildings 17 years later, when the mountain itself finally erupted. Some ancient writers, including the philosopher and playwright Seneca, wrote at length about that 62 CE earthquake, attempting to explain its causes through the natural philosophy of the day. Theories involving underground wind and shifting air pockets, rather than anything resembling modern plate tectonics or volcanic activity. since the connection between earthquakes and volcanic eruptions wasn't something Roman natural philosophy had any real framework for recognizing. Modern volcanologists studying the region's geological history have since identified evidence of increasing seismic activity in the years and months immediately preceding the 79 CE eruption. Tremors that a modern monitoring network would likely have flagged as significant warning signs, but which Pompeii's residents, having already lived through the larger 62 CE earthquake without any eruption following it, had little reason to interpret as anything unusual or specifically dangerous. Chapter 3: Pliny the Elder and a Fateful Curiosity. Much of what we know about the eruption's actual timeline comes from an extraordinary surviving eyewitness account, written by Pliny the Younger, a Roman administrator and writer, describing events from the perspective of his uncle, Pliny the Elder, a naval commander, scholar, and one of history's most tirelessly curious writers. Pliny the Elder was stationed with the Roman fleet at Misenum, across the bay from Vesuvius, when the eruption began. Rather than simply observing from a safe distance, his scholarly curiosity, and later, a wish to rescue trapped friends and coastal residents, drove him to sail directly toward the eruption to get a closer look and attempt a rescue. Pliny the Younger's letters, written years later at the request of the historian Tacitus, remain so detailed and scientifically observant that volcanologists today still use the term Plinian eruption to describe this specific type of violent, high-column volcanic eruption, naming an entire category of geological event after a Roman writer who happened to describe one with such careful, lasting precision. Pliny the Younger was only 17 at the time of the eruption, staying safely across the bay with his mother, while his uncle sailed toward the danger. And his two surviving letters describing the event, written decades later, remain remarkable not only for their scientific precision, but for their calm, careful honesty about his own fear, describing ash falling on the ships, pumice stones bouncing off the deck, and his own mother urging him to leave her behind and save himself as they fled the ashfall, reaching even their side of the bay. The young Pliny's account also captures small, very human details amid the chaos. People tying pillows to their heads as makeshift protection from falling debris. A strange, darkened midday sky that felt, in his own words, less like nightfall than like being shut into a darkened room with the light put out, and a crowd of frightened people convinced, in that terrifying darkness, that the world itself was ending around them. Chapter 4: The Fleet Commander's Final Hours. Pliny the Elder's own fate that day, described secondhand by his nephew based on accounts from those who survived alongside him, offers one of antiquity's most vivid, personally detailed records of a single named individual's death during a natural disaster. Rather than turning back once the danger became clear, Pliny the Elder pressed forward across the bay toward the town of Stabi. reportedly reassuring his frightened companions along the way with calm, deliberately composed remarks, even pausing to bathe and eat a meal as falling ash and pumice continued accumulating outside. A display of studied calm his nephew's account suggests may have been as much for his companion's morale as genuine unconcern on his own part. By the following morning, with the air thick with ash and sulphurous fumes, Pliny the Elder was found dead on the beach at Stabi, his body reportedly unmarked, leading his nephew and later historians to speculate about causes ranging from a heart attack aggravated by the physical strain and toxic fumes, to being simply overcome by poisonous volcanic gas. His death, representing one of history's most detailed and moving accounts of an ordinary, if distinguished, individual's final hours during a documented ancient natural disaster. Chapter 5. The column rises. According to Pliny's account, the eruption began around midday on August 24th, 79 CE, a date now genuinely debated among historians and archaeologists, with some archaeological evidence, including season-appropriate fruit and warm-weather clothing, found among the remains, suggesting an October date may actually be more accurate than the traditionally cited August 1. Pliny the Younger described watching an enormous cloud rise from the mountain like an umbrella pine tree, a strikingly precise, recognizable description of what volcanologists now call a Plinian eruption column. Ash and pumice thrown miles into the atmosphere before spreading outward and beginning to fall back down across the surrounding countryside. For the people of Pompeii, this initial phase, however frightening and strange, wasn't immediately fatal. Falling pumice and ash accumulated gradually over the following hours, giving many residents time to flee the town entirely, gathering what belongings they could carry and heading away from the mountain along the roads leading to safety. Archaeologists have recovered numerous sets of footprints and cartwheel ruts pressed into the earliest, still soft layers of fallen pumice along roads leading away from Pompeii, physical evidence of this early, largely successful evacuation. A detail that helps modern researchers reconstruct roughly how many hours passed and how deep the pumice had already accumulated before conditions became too dangerous for safe travel on foot or by cart. The falling pumice itself, though frightening, was relatively lightweight and in small quantities, not immediately lethal, more comparable to a heavy, disorienting hailstorm than an instantly deadly event. The real danger, as later chapters will cover, came not from this initial hours-long accumulation, but from what happened once the eruption's character shifted entirely, hours into the disaster. Chapter 6. Those who stayed and those who couldn't leave. Archaeological evidence suggests a significant portion of Pompeii's population did successfully evacuate during this initial, survivable phase of the eruption, before conditions turned truly deadly. But a substantial number of residents remained, for reasons modern historians can only partially reconstruct from the physical evidence left behind. Some likely stayed to protect their homes and property from looters, a genuine concern in a chaotic, partially evacuated town. Others, particularly the elderly, the injured, or enslaved people without the freedom to simply leave, may have been physically unable to make the difficult journey away from the mountain in time, or were kept behind by owners prioritizing property over their safety. Still others may have simply misjudged the danger, having no prior experience or cultural memory of volcanic eruption to draw on, reasonably assuming the worst had already passed once the initial ashfall seemed to slow or pause, not understanding that the eruption's most lethal phase hadn't even begun yet. Modern archaeological analysis of skeletal remains found within Pompeii's buildings, rather than scattered along evacuation routes, has revealed a genuinely diverse cross-section of who stayed behind: men, women, children, and the elderly, wearing jewelry and carrying money and valuables, suggesting many weren't simply too poor or too enslaved to leave, but had made a considered, ultimately fatal decision to wait out the disaster indoors, rather than risk the chaos and uncertainty of the roads. Some victims were found in positions suggesting they were still actively gathering possessions or sheltering in what they likely believed were the safest parts of their homes, doorways and interior rooms away from windows, a reasonable response to a falling debris hazard that offered no protection at all against the pyroclastic flows that would ultimately prove fatal instead. Chapter 7: Pyroclastic Flows. In the early hours of the eruption's second day, the volcanic column that had been rising steadily for hours finally began to collapse under its own enormous weight, sending superheated clouds of gas, ash, and rock racing down the mountain slopes at speeds that could exceed 100 miles per hour, reaching temperatures hot enough to kill instantly. These pyroclastic flows and surges, rather than the earlier, more survivable ashfall, are now understood by volcanologists as the eruption's true killing mechanism, responsible for the vast majority of deaths in Pompeii and the neighboring town of Herculaneum, closer still to the mountain, which was buried even more completely and suddenly than Pompeii itself. The speed and heat of these flows meant that death, for those still in their path, came with almost no warning and very little suffering by comparison to slower disasters. Modern forensic analysis of victims' remains, discussed further in a later chapter, suggests death likely occurred within seconds for many of those caught directly in a pyroclastic surge's path. Volcanologists studying the deposits left behind have identified multiple distinct pyroclastic surges over the course of that second terrible morning, each one burying the town under another dense layer of hot ash and debris, gradually building up the many feet of material that would eventually seal Pompeii away from the world for the next 17 centuries. careful stratigraphic analysis of these deposits, examining the distinct layers, much as a geologist might read tree rings, has allowed volcanologists to reconstruct the eruption's precise sequence with genuine scientific confidence, distinguishing between the lighter, more porous pumice fall deposits of the eruption's earlier hours and the denser, more compacted pyroclastic flow deposits that followed, each layer telling its own small part of the disaster's overall story. The first of these surges reached Pompeii itself, somewhat further from the mountain than Herculaneum, with slightly reduced force compared to what struck the closer town, which is part of why some Pompeii residents in more protected locations survived slightly longer than their counterparts closer to the volcano, before subsequent, even more powerful surges finally overtook the entire town completely. Chapter 8: A City Sealed in Time. By the time the eruption finally ended, Pompeii lay buried under an estimated 13 to 20 feet of ash and pumice, while nearby Herculaneum, buried by different, denser pyroclastic material, was preserved in some ways even more completely. Its wooden furniture, food, and even papyrus scrolls surviving in ways Pompeii's drier ash layer didn't allow for. This burial, catastrophic as it was for the people living through it, created something genuinely unique in the archaeological record. A moment of ordinary daily Roman life, frozen essentially instantly, protected from the slow decay, looting, and rebuilding that erases most ancient sites gradually over centuries, preserving Pompeii instead in a single, sudden, terrible moment. The town remained buried and largely forgotten for well over 1,500 years, its exact location eventually fading even from local memory, known mainly through vague references in surviving ancient texts, until construction workers digging a new canal in the late 16th century accidentally rediscovered ancient walls and inscriptions, though systematic archaeological excavation wouldn't begin in earnest for nearly 2 more centuries after that. Even after that 16th century rediscovery, the site's true identity wasn't immediately understood. Early finds were initially misattributed to the nearby town of Stabii, and only later, careful analysis of recovered inscriptions bearing the name Pompeii confirmed exactly which lost Roman town workers had actually stumbled upon, buried and waiting quietly beneath centuries of accumulated vineyard soil. Formal excavations began in earnest in 1748, initially motivated less by careful scholarly archaeology and more by treasure hunting for the royal collection of the Bourbon King of Naples, with early digging methods considerably rougher and more destructive than the careful, methodical techniques archaeologists would eventually develop as the field of archaeology itself matured alongside the ongoing excavation of the site. Early excavators frequently reburied sections they had already uncovered once the most valuable or visually striking objects had been removed, a practice that seems almost unthinkable by modern archaeological standards, but reflected the very different priorities of an era more interested in acquiring impressive royal treasures than in preserving an entire ancient town's complete, undisturbed context for future scholarly study. Chapter 9: The Discovery of the Body Cavities. One of Pompeii's most haunting and technically ingenious archaeological discoveries came in the 1860s, when the Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli, overseeing excavations at the site, noticed that hardened ash layers sometimes contained hollow cavities, the exact shape and size of a human body, long since decomposed within the solidified ash. Fiorelli's insight rested on a straightforward, but genuinely clever observation. The volcanic ash and debris had hardened around each victim's body shortly after death, and while the body itself slowly decomposed over the following decades and centuries, it left behind a perfectly preserved negative space, an empty cavity holding the exact shape of a person who was no longer physically present at all. Fiorelli developed a technique of carefully pouring plaster into these cavities before excavating further, creating detailed casts that captured not just the shape, but often the exact posture, clothing folds, and even facial expressions of victims at the moment of their death. A technique still used, refined with modern materials like resin, by archaeologists working at the site today. Fiorelli's broader contribution to Pompeii's excavation went well beyond the casting technique itself. He introduced far more systematic, careful excavation methods generally, dividing the town into numbered regions and blocks still used by archaeologists today, moving Pompeii's excavation away from earlier, cruder treasure hunting approaches towards something recognizably closer to modern, methodical archaeological practice. These plaster casts remain some of the most viscerally moving artifacts from the ancient world anywhere on Earth, showing ordinary people, a family huddled together, a dog straining against its chain, in their final, very human moments. A level of intimate, direct connection to specific individual ancient people that few other archaeological sites can offer in quite the same way. One particularly well-known cast, sometimes called the muleteer, or simply recognized by the striking clarity of its final gesture, shows a man lying face down with his hands positioned, as if attempting, uselessly, to shield his face from the heat and ash. A small, universally human reflex captured permanently in plaster, instantly understandable to any modern viewer, despite the nearly 2,000-year gap separating them. Fiorelli's casting technique also proved unexpectedly useful for objects beyond human and animal bodies. Wooden furniture, doors, and shutters, long since decomposed within the hardened ash, left similar hollow cavities that could be filled and cast in the same way, allowing archaeologists to recreate objects that would otherwise have left no trace at all beyond an empty, unexplained void within the excavated ash layers. Chapter 10: The slower realization of what Vesuvius was. for nearly 17 centuries after the eruption, even as Pompeii and Herculaneum lay buried and eventually rediscovered. A full scientific understanding of exactly what had happened and why developed only gradually, piece by piece, alongside the broader development of the earth sciences themselves. Early modern naturalists studying the rediscovered towns in the 18th century recognized the volcanic origin of the burial material readily enough. But a genuine, systematic understanding of eruption mechanics, pyroclastic flows, and the specific sequence of events that had actually killed Pompeii's victims wouldn't fully develop until volcanology matured as its own dedicated scientific discipline, drawing directly on detailed studies of Vesuvius itself, alongside other volcanoes studied around the world. The Italian volcanologist Giuseppe Mercalli, working at an observatory established directly on Vesuvius's slopes in the 19th century, one of the first dedicated volcano observatories anywhere in the world, contributed significantly to this developing scientific understanding, and his name survives today in the Mercalli intensity scale, still used alongside the more familiar Richter scale to measure earthquake effects on the ground and on human structures. It wasn't until relatively recent decades, using modern volcanological fieldwork, careful stratigraphic analysis of the deposited ash and pyroclastic layers, and forensic study of victims' remains, that scientists were finally able to reconstruct the eruption's actual hour-by-hour sequence with real confidence, meaning our present, detailed understanding of exactly what happened to Pompeii is, in a real sense, a genuinely modern scientific achievement, even though the disaster itself happened nearly 2,000 years ago. Chapter 11: What Pompeii's walls actually say. Pompeii's excavated walls preserved something few other ancient sites have retained in such volume. Thousands of pieces of everyday graffiti, scratched or painted directly onto walls throughout the town, offering an unusually candid, unfiltered window into ordinary Roman thoughts, humor, and daily concerns. Surviving graffiti ranges from political campaign endorsements and advertisements for gladiatorial games to love poetry, insults between neighbors, and simple boasts. One frequently cited example has a resident bragging about his own drinking capacity, while another records a student's frustrated complaint about a difficult teacher. Small, remarkably relatable human moments separated from modern readers by nearly 2,000 years. This graffiti has proven enormously valuable to historians precisely because it wasn't meant for posterity or careful preservation. Unlike formal inscriptions commissioned to celebrate an emperor or commemorate an official event, Pompeii's graffiti captures ordinary Romans speaking, quite literally, in their own unfiltered voice, for an audience of neighbors and passers-by rather than history itself. Election graffiti proved especially abundant, with local candidates and their supporters painting endorsements across town walls ahead of municipal elections, sometimes accompanied by curious, specific endorsements from particular trade groups, bakers, fruit sellers, or fullers, the launderers who handled Pompeii's textile cleaning, suggesting organized local guilds actively participated in ordinary town politics, much like modern interest groups might today. Some surviving graffiti captures more personal, even poignant moments. One frequently cited inscription reads simply, "Whoever loves, let him flourish. Let him perish who knows not love." A line of anonymous romantic poetry left by an unnamed resident that continues to resonate with visitors reading it on the same wall, nearly 2,000 years after it was first scratched there. Chapter 12: Bread, Bars, and Ordinary Business. Pompeii's excavated streets have revealed an extraordinarily detailed picture of ordinary Roman commercial life. Over 100 bars and food shops called thermopolia have been identified across the town. Small counter-service establishments with built-in ceramic containers for keeping food and drink warm. Essentially, an ancient equivalent of a modern fast food counter. A well-preserved bakery near the town's forum still contains its original large stone mills and oven, and archaeologists even recovered carbonized loaves of bread, preserved by the same volcanic heat that destroyed them, some still bearing a baker's stamped mark, identifying the specific bakery that produced them nearly 2,000 years ago. The stone mills used in Pompeii's bakeries followed a design consistent across the wider Roman world. A fixed lower cone-shaped stone and a rotating upper hourglass-shaped stone, turned either by donkey power, harnessed to a wooden beam extending from the mill, or in smaller operations by direct human labor, grinding grain into flour through a slow, physically demanding process, repeated daily to keep the town supplied with fresh bread. Roman bread itself came in numerous varieties depending on the flour's quality and the baker's specific recipe. From coarse, dark bread made from unrefined grain and eaten widely by ordinary residents, to finer white bread reserved for wealthier customers, a range of options that archaeologists have been able to identify directly from surviving carbonized loaves recovered at multiple bakeries across the excavated town. Pompeii's economy also relied heavily on garum, the fermented fish sauce covered in an earlier comfy sleeping story on the Roman Empire's daily cuisine, with the town serving as a significant regional production center. Archaeologists have identified specific workshops dedicated to producing this pungent, valuable condiment, exported across the wider Roman world from this single, prosperous coastal town. One prominent Pompeii resident, Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, built his considerable wealth in public, standing substantially on the garum trade, going so far as to decorate his own house's floor mosaics with images of the very amphora jars used to transport his product, complete with labels advertising his sauce's quality. A strikingly direct, almost boastful piece of ancient product branding, permanently embedded in his own home's decoration for any visitor to see. Pompeii's wine production was similarly significant, with the fertile volcanic soil surrounding the town. The very same soil created by Vesuvius's earlier eruptions centuries before, supporting extensive vineyards whose wine was exported across the Mediterranean, carried in distinctive amphorae, stamped with markings identifying their specific origin, allowing modern archaeologists to trace Pompeian wine exports to sites as far away as southern France and North Africa. Excavations of Pompeii's actual vineyards, made possible through the same root cavity plaster casting technique used elsewhere in the town's gardens, have revealed the precise ancient planting patterns and vine training methods used by Pompeian farmers, allowing modern researchers and even a few dedicated experimental winemakers to recreate wine grown using historically accurate ancient techniques. In some cases, producing genuinely drinkable modern wine from vines planted according to 2,000-year-old Roman agricultural methods, grown on the very same volcanic soil. The market for Pompeian goods extended well beyond simple food products. 2. Archaeologists have identified specialized workshops for metalworking, textile production, and pottery throughout the town, each contributing to a genuinely diverse local economy that, in the hours before the eruption, was functioning as an entirely ordinary, prosperous provincial Roman trading town, with no sign at all of the catastrophe that was about to end it so abruptly and completely. Chapter 13. The Forum's political and commercial heartbeat. Pompeii's Forum, already mentioned briefly earlier in tonight's story, deserves a fuller look as the genuine civic and commercial center around which the entire town's public life actually revolved. Bordered by temples, the town's basilica or law court covered market halls and various civic administrative buildings. The Forum served simultaneously as marketplace, courthouse, religious center, and public gathering space, much as a modern town square combined with a courthouse and city hall might function today, all packed into one busy, centrally located public area. The Basilica, Pompeii's largest surviving public building, functioned as a covered hall for legal proceedings and business transactions, its impressive scale and architecture reflecting the genuine importance Romans placed on formal legal process even at the local, provincial level, far from Rome's own grander courts and senate. Market days would have brought farmers and merchants from the surrounding countryside into the Forum to sell produce, livestock, and goods, transforming the space from its quieter administrative function into a genuinely bustling commercial hub, filled with the noise, smell, and energy of ordinary agricultural trade, meeting urban commerce in one central, shared public space. Chapter 14. Art on every wall. Pompeii's preserved buildings contain an extraordinary volume of Roman wall painting, offering art historians a far more complete picture of Roman domestic decorative style than nearly any other single site, since most Roman paintings elsewhere have long since faded, been painted over, or simply crumbled away over the intervening centuries. The famous Villa of the Mysteries, just outside Pompeii's walls, contains a remarkably well-preserved cycle of large, vividly colored paintings depicting what scholars believe are scenes from a mystery religious initiation ritual. Their exact meaning still debated, but their artistic quality and preservation making them among the most studied and reproduced examples of Roman painting anywhere in the world. The specific deep red pigment used throughout the Villa of the Mysteries frescoes, often called Pompeian red, has become so closely associated with the site that the color itself carries the town's name in art and design contexts today. Even though similar red pigments, derived from iron oxide minerals called ochre and hematite, were actually used quite widely across the wider Roman world, not uniquely at Pompeii alone. Scholars remain divided on exactly what ritual or mystery cult the Villa of the Mysteries frescoes actually depict, with theories ranging from initiation into the worship of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstatic religious experience, to a bride's ritual preparation for marriage. The painting's genuine ambiguity, ironically, has only deepened popular and scholarly fascination with the room over the many decades since its excavation. Pompeian wall painting styles have been carefully classified by art historians into 4 distinct chronological styles, tracing changing Roman decorative fashion across roughly 2 centuries leading up to the Eruption, giving scholars an unusually precise, datable framework for understanding how Roman interior design and taste evolved, made possible specifically because Pompeii's destruction froze this evolution at one definitively dated final moment. The earliest of these styles imitated expensive marble paneling, using nothing more than painted plaster, a cost-effective way for less wealthy homeowners to suggest the appearance of luxury they couldn't actually afford in solid stone. Later styles grew increasingly ambitious, incorporating illusionistic architectural details, painted columns and vistas designed to make small rooms feel larger and more open, and eventually elaborate mythological scenes, populated with detailed figures, gods, and narrative storytelling covering entire walls. This progression reveals something genuinely valuable about Roman taste and aspiration more broadly, not merely at Pompeii, but across the wider Roman world. The desire to project wealth, sophistication, and cultural literacy through home decoration wasn't confined only to the genuinely rich, but extended in more modest and creative forms to households across a much wider range of the social and economic spectrum, all striving toward broadly similar aesthetic ideals within their own particular means. Chapter 15: Slaves, Freedmen, and Ordinary Workers. Pompeii's excavated town, like every Roman community of its era, depended heavily on enslaved labor, and archaeological and inscriptional evidence throughout the site offers a genuinely detailed, if often uncomfortable, picture of how slavery actually functioned in ordinary daily Roman provincial life. Enslaved people at Pompeii worked across nearly every sector of the town's economy, from household service in wealthy homes to skilled craft production. And inscriptions throughout the town record numerous freedmen, formerly enslaved people who had gained their freedom, who went on to achieve genuine local prominence and even public office, particularly within religious and civic roles, specifically created to accommodate freedmen's ambiguous social status between slavery and full citizenship. The house of Julia Felix, a wealthy Pompeian woman who ran what appears to have been a substantial rental property business, including a bath complex and dining spaces let out to paying customers, gives historians a rare, detailed glimpse of independent Roman female business ownership. Her surviving property advertisement, painted directly on an exterior wall, reading almost exactly like a modern real estate listing describing available amenities to potential tenants. Pompeii's bakeries, in particular, relied heavily on enslaved labor operating large stone mills, grinding grain into flour through hours of genuinely exhausting physical work. And archaeologists have found evidence at several sites of these mills being operated not only by donkeys, but, in at least some documented cases, by enslaved workers themselves, laboring under conditions that surviving Roman literary sources occasionally describe with rare, explicit sympathy for how genuinely harsh this particular form of labor actually was. Chapter 16: The Bodies That Weren't What They Seemed. Modern forensic and scientific analysis of Pompeii's victims has continued revealing new information well into the 21st century, sometimes overturning assumptions that had gone unchallenged since the site's earliest excavations. DNA analysis conducted on several famous plaster casts, long assumed by earlier excavators and popular tradition to depict specific family relationships based simply on their physical proximity and apparent embrace, has in some cases revealed the individuals weren't biologically related at all. And in at least one well-publicized case, a cast long identified as a mother and child was found through genetic testing to actually be two men, unrelated to each other. A humbling reminder that even physically intimate, seemingly obvious historical scenes can be badly misread without genuine scientific verification. CT scanning of plaster casts, without damaging the casts themselves, has also revealed details about victims' health, diet, and even dental condition, showing a population with generally good dental health by ancient standards, likely reflecting a diet lower in refined sugar than many later historical periods, alongside evidence of hard physical labor, and in some cases, old healed injuries consistent with the physically demanding nature of ordinary Roman working life. One particularly striking recent finding involved a cast long assumed to show a wealthy individual based on gold jewelry found nearby, which DNA and skeletal analysis instead suggested belonged to an enslaved man, wearing jewelry that may have belonged to someone else entirely. or been looted in the chaos of evacuation before the wearer himself was overtaken by the same disaster he may have been trying to profit from, a small, genuinely uncertain mystery that modern science can only partially resolve, illustrating how much interpretation, even now, still depends on careful, humble uncertainty rather than confident assumption. Isotope analysis of victims' bones and teeth, which can reveal information about diet, and even where a person spent their childhood based on the specific chemical signatures absorbed into developing teeth, has also allowed researchers to identify which Pompeii residents were likely born locally versus those who had migrated to the town from elsewhere in the Roman world, adding yet another layer of demographic detail to a population that, thanks to catastrophe, remains far better understood than almost any other ordinary Roman community from this period. A particularly striking recent study examined victims found in the so-called Garden of the Fugitives, a group who died together while attempting to flee across an open vineyard area, using modern imaging and skeletal analysis to reconstruct their approximate ages, general health, and even likely relationships to one another, painting an unusually complete, humanizing picture of one small group's final, desperate attempt at escape, frozen at the exact moment it failed. Researchers have also used isotope and skeletal analysis to investigate whether Pompeii's population showed evidence of the broader Roman world's documented use of lead, commonly used in water pipes, and even as a sweetener in some cooking practices, finding elevated lead levels consistent with other studied Roman populations. A sobering, if largely inconclusive, footnote to ongoing historical debate about whether lead exposure may have contributed to health problems across the wider Roman world more broadly. A question modern science still hasn't fully resolved, even with directly testable ancient remains available at sites like Pompeii. Chapter 17: A Doctor's House and Ancient Medical Practice. One particularly evocative excavated house at Pompeii, identified by archaeologists as belonging to a practicing physician based on the surgical instruments recovered within it, offers a rare, direct window into ancient Roman medical practice at the local, provincial level. The instruments recovered from this so-called house of the surgeon include forceps, scalpels, and specialized tools for a range of procedures, remarkably similar in basic design to instruments that would remain in medical use for many centuries afterward, suggesting a level of practical medical sophistication in the Roman world considerably more advanced than popular imagination sometimes credits. Roman medicine at this level, practiced by local doctors serving ordinary provincial towns like Pompeii, blended genuine anatomical and surgical knowledge, much of it inherited from earlier Greek medical tradition, with treatments modern medicine would consider ineffective or even harmful. A mixture of real, demonstrable skill and considerable superstition that characterized ancient medical practice across the wider Roman world, not uniquely at Pompeii alone. Chapter 18: Herculaneum's Different Fate. While Pompeii draws the greatest popular fame, the smaller coastal town of Herculaneum, closer to Vesuvius itself, suffered an even more sudden, complete burial, and has yielded its own remarkable, sometimes more strikingly preserved archaeological treasures. Herculaneum's burial under dense pyroclastic material, rather than Pompeii's lighter, falling ash and pumice, preserved organic material to an extraordinary degree, including wooden furniture, doors, and roof beams that survived essentially carbonized but structurally intact, along with an entire library of papyrus scrolls at the so-called Villa of the Papyri, which modern researchers are still working to read using advanced imaging technology that can decipher the badly carbonized scrolls without physically unrolling and destroying them. This ongoing scroll reading project has produced genuinely exciting recent breakthroughs, with researchers using particle accelerator scanning combined with machine learning techniques to virtually unroll and read individual carbonized scrolls without ever physically touching them, successfully extracting readable Greek philosophical text from scrolls that had been considered permanently unreadable for well over 2 centuries since their original discovery. For a long time, Herculaneum's death toll seemed puzzlingly low compared to Pompeii's, until excavations along the ancient shoreline in the 1980s revealed hundreds of skeletons huddled inside stone boat chambers, apparently sheltering there while awaiting rescue by sea that never came in time. A discovery that dramatically revised historians' understanding of how many people had actually died in the smaller town and how they had spent their final, desperate hours. These boat chamber victims, packed tightly together in spaces originally built to store fishing boats and equipment, included men, women, and children of varying social status, based on jewelry and possessions found alongside the remains, suggesting that when the true danger became clear, social distinctions that governed ordinary daily life gave way to a shared, desperate hope for rescue by sea, a hope the historical record confirms never arrived in time for anyone sheltering in those particular chambers. The Villa of the Papyri's library, still being carefully studied today using X-ray and particle accelerator imaging technology, originally developed for entirely different scientific purposes, may contain works of ancient literature and philosophy lost everywhere else in the ancient world, meaning Herculaneum's ongoing excavation and analysis could still, even now, nearly 2,000 years later, reveal entirely new ancient texts that no scholar has read since the eruption itself sealed them away. Chapter 19: The Baths of an Ordinary Roman Town. Like every substantial Roman town, Pompeii maintained public bathhouses at the center of its daily social life, and the remarkably well-preserved Forum baths and Stabian baths give modern visitors an unusually complete picture of how this genuinely central Roman institution actually functioned in ordinary practice. Pompeii's baths followed the standard Roman progression familiar across the empire. A cold room called the Frigidarium, a warm room called the Tepidarium, and a hot room called the Caldarium, each heated, in the warmer rooms, by an ingenious underfloor heating system called a hypocaust, where hot air from a furnace circulated beneath a raised floor and through hollow spaces in the walls themselves. The Stabian Baths, among the oldest surviving public bath complexes in the entire Roman world, show clear evidence of expansion and renovation across several centuries of continuous use, reflecting the bathhouse's role not merely as a place to get clean, but as a genuine daily social hub where Romans of different classes might exercise, socialize, conduct business, and relax, often spending several hours there as an ordinary part of the daily routine. Separate bathing facilities, or scheduled separate hours for men and women, were standard practice at Pompeii's baths, reflecting broader Roman social convention around mixed bathing. Though the exact arrangements varied somewhat between different bath complexes and different periods of the town's history, based on surviving physical evidence of separate entrances and changing rooms, archaeologists have identified at several of the excavated sites. Chapter 20: Earthquakes, Repairs, and a Town Under Construction. By the time of the eruption, Pompeii had spent nearly 2 decades in a state of ongoing reconstruction following the serious earthquake of 62 CE. And archaeological evidence throughout the excavated town reveals a community still very much in the process of repairing itself when the eruption finally struck. Several prominent public buildings, including sections of the Forum itself, show clear signs of incomplete repair work at the moment of the eruption, with building materials, stacked bricks, and unfinished wall sections found exactly where ancient workers had left them, suggesting Pompeii's residents genuinely expected to finish this long, ongoing reconstruction project eventually, with no sense that their town's story was about to end so abruptly and completely instead. This extended reconstruction effort also reveals something valuable about Roman urban resilience and the ordinary rhythm of disaster recovery in the ancient world. Rather than abandoning the earthquake-damaged town, Pompeii's residents and civic authorities had spent nearly 2 decades methodically rebuilding. A genuine, sustained community effort that the eruption's sudden arrival cut short before it could ever be completed, freezing the town in a state of half-finished renewal rather than either full ruin or full restoration. Some historians and archaeologists have speculated that the ongoing reconstruction work and the general sense that Pompeii had already weathered its worst crisis with the 62 CE earthquake may have actively contributed to residents' underestimation of the danger when the mountain itself finally began showing signs of activity nearly 2 decades later. A community naturally inclined, after years of hard-won recovery, to interpret new tremors as more of the same familiar seismic activity, rather than the precursor to something entirely different and far more dangerous. Chapter 21: life interrupted down to the smallest detail. Perhaps nothing captures Pompeii's unique archaeological value, quite like the sheer mundane specificity of what survived. Archaeologists have recovered carbonized food, including eggs, bread, and fruit, still arranged as they had been left on the day of the eruption, offering an unusually literal snapshot of an interrupted, ordinary moment. Household items ranging from surgical tools found in a doctor's house to children's toys, jewelry still worn by fleeing residents, and even a dog's collar have all been recovered largely intact, allowing modern visitors and researchers alike a level of direct, tangible connection to specific individual ancient lives that most archaeological sites, reconstructed from scattered fragments across centuries, simply cannot offer. Even Pompeii's gardens have been studied in remarkable botanical detail, with archaeologists using the same plaster casting technique originally developed for human bodies to recreate root cavities left by long-decayed plants, allowing researchers to identify exactly what species of trees, vines, and flowers grew in specific gardens on the morning of the eruption, right down to individual root systems preserved in volcanic ash for nearly 2,000 years. This botanical research has revealed genuinely detailed information about ancient Roman gardening practices, including exact planting patterns, evidence of grafting techniques used on fruit trees, and even pollen analysis, identifying which specific flowers were in bloom at the moment of the eruption, allowing researchers to state, with real scientific confidence, precisely what a Pompeian garden actually looked and smelled like on that final, ordinary late summer or early autumn morning. Animal remains, too, have added their own layer of detail to this picture, including the famous plaster cast of a chained guard dog found twisted in apparent agony near a house entrance, alongside evidence of horses, mules, and even a small menagerie of household pets, painting a fuller, more complete picture of Pompeii as a genuinely lived-in place, populated not only by people, but by the full range of animal life any ordinary ancient town would have depended on and cared for. Chapter 22: Temples and Everyday Religion at Pompeii. Pompeii's religious life, like the rest of the wider Roman world, centered on a mix of major state-sponsored temples and countless smaller, more personal household and neighborhood shrines, giving archaeologists an unusually complete picture of how ordinary religious practice actually operated at every level of a Roman town. The town's largest temple, dedicated to Jupiter and situated prominently at the northern end of the Forum, served as Pompeii's principal civic religious building, though it too was still being repaired from earthquake damage at the time of the eruption. Nearby stood temples to Apollo, Venus, considered Pompeii's special civic patron deity, and reflecting Egypt's own cultural influence across the wider Roman world. A temple dedicated to the Egyptian goddess Isis, whose worship had spread widely across the Mediterranean by this period. The Temple of Isis, smaller than the grander civic temples, but remarkably well preserved, offered a glimpse of the increasingly cosmopolitan, multicultural character of Roman religious life by this period. With Egyptian religious practices, imagery, and ritual objects sitting comfortably alongside more traditional Roman civic worship, evidence of just how far Isis worship had traveled from its original Egyptian homeland by the 1st century CE. Beyond these major public temples, household shrines called lararia, dedicated to protective household spirits, much like those covered in an earlier comfy sleeping story on ancient Egypt's own household religious practices, appear in nearly every excavated Pompeian home, ranging from simple painted niches to elaborate small architectural shrines, reflecting how deeply religious practice was woven into the most ordinary, everyday corners of Roman domestic life, not confined only to grand public temples. Chapter 23. What Pompeii taught us about Rome itself. Beyond its dramatic destruction, Pompeii has fundamentally shaped modern understanding of ordinary Roman provincial life in ways that written ancient sources, largely composed by and for Rome's wealthy elite, never could on their own. Pompeii reveals a genuinely mixed, complex urban society, with grand villas standing near modest workshops and cramped upper-story apartments, enslaved people, freedmen, and free citizens, all living in close physical proximity. A level of everyday social mixing that literary sources focused on senators and emperors rarely bother to describe in any comparable detail. The town's extensive, well-preserved political graffiti, recording countless local election campaigns for minor town offices, has also given historians an unusually detailed picture of how ordinary Roman civic and electoral life actually functioned at the local level, filling in a level of everyday democratic participation largely invisible in surviving accounts of Rome's grander, more famous imperial politics. Pompeii's Amphitheater, one of the oldest surviving stone amphitheaters anywhere in the Roman world, was the site of a notorious riot in 59 CE between Pompeii's own residents and visiting spectators from the neighboring town of Nuceria. A violent brawl serious enough that the Roman Senate itself banned gladiatorial games at Pompeii for a full decade afterward, a punishment recorded both by the historian Tacitus and, remarkably, in a surviving wall painting from Pompeii itself, depicting the very riot in question. The amphitheater itself, built around 70 BCE, predates Rome's own famous Colosseum, covered in an earlier comfy sleeping story on the Roman Empire's rise and fall by roughly a century and a half, making Pompeii's arena one of the very earliest purpose-built stone amphitheaters anywhere in the Roman world. A genuine architectural pioneer rather than simply a smaller provincial copy of Rome's own later, more famous arena. This riot and its unusually severe punishment offers historians a rare, well-documented example of how seriously Roman authorities could treat local civic disorder, even in a relatively minor provincial town. A reminder that Pompeii's ordinary residents however routine their daily lives, were still fully subject to the same imperial Roman legal and political authority that governed the empire's grandest cities. Chapter 24. Reading Pompeii's Houses. The excavated homes of Pompeii, ranging from grand, elaborately decorated villas to small, cramped apartments above shops, offer archaeologists an unusually complete cross-section of ordinary Roman domestic architecture and daily household life. The largest and wealthiest homes, like the aptly named House of the Faun, one of Pompeii's grandest private residences, followed a consistent Roman architectural pattern. A formal entrance leading to an atrium, an open central hall often featuring a shallow pool to collect rainwater, followed by more private family rooms, and finally, an open garden courtyard called a peristyle, often the most beautifully decorated and carefully maintained space in the entire house. Wealthy Pompeian homeowners used their house's decoration deliberately as a form of social display, commissioning elaborate mosaic floors, painted frescoes, and sculpture specifically to impress visitors and clients received in the more public-facing rooms near the entrance, while reserving simpler decoration for private family spaces further inside. Roman domestic architecture functioned, in this sense, as a carefully calibrated instrument of social status as much as simple shelter. The House of the Faun takes its name from a striking bronze statue of a dancing faun found at its entrance, and the house's floor also once held the famous Alexander mosaic, an extraordinarily detailed depiction of Alexander the Great in battle, likely against the Persian king Darius, now preserved in a Naples museum, a vivid reminder that wealthy Pompeians looked well beyond their own town for artistic and historical inspiration, drawing directly on the same wider Hellenistic Greek world covered in earlier comfy sleeping stories on ancient Egypt and the Roman Empire alike. Smaller Pompeian homes and the upper-story apartments common above street-level shops tell a very different, equally valuable story of more ordinary daily life. Cramped, simply furnished, and often shared among extended families or unrelated tenants, these more modest dwellings housed the shopkeepers, craftsmen, and laborers who made up the majority of Pompeii's actual population. Even though grander houses tend to dominate popular images and tourist itineraries of the site today. Chapter 25. The Amphitheater's Long Afternoon. Beyond the notorious riot covered earlier, Pompeii's amphitheater hosted the same broader range of gladiatorial spectacle covered in an earlier comfy sleeping story on Roman entertainment more generally. And surviving painted advertisements throughout the town reveal how these events were promoted and anticipated by ordinary residents in the weeks before each show. These advertisements, painted directly onto street-facing walls, typically named the sponsoring official, promised specific numbers of gladiator pairs, and sometimes mentioned additional attractions like wild animal hunts or awnings to shield the crowd from the sun. essentially functioning as ancient event posters, remarkably similar in basic purpose to a modern flyer, advertising an upcoming concert or sporting event. Local political candidates frequently sponsored these games specifically to build public goodwill ahead of town elections, a direct, practical link between entertainment and ordinary local politics that archaeologists have traced clearly through Pompeii's combined collection of election graffiti and gladiatorial advertisements, both competing for the same walls and the same public attention across the town's busiest streets. Chapter 26. A cultural icon is born. Pompeii's rediscovery in the 18th century and the systematic excavations that followed through the 19th and 20th centuries sparked exactly the kind of Egyptomania-style cultural fascination covered in an earlier comfy sleeping story on ancient Egypt, with Pompeian imagery and decorative style influencing European art, fashion, and architecture for generations. The site became an essential stop on the Grand Tour, the extended educational travels wealthy young Europeans, particularly the British aristocracy, undertook across the continent, cementing Pompeii's place in European cultural imagination as a uniquely vivid, tangible window into the classical past that no ruin or museum artifact elsewhere could quite match. Some of Pompeii's most valuable, and at the time, most explicit artistic discoveries proved genuinely controversial for 18th and 19th century sensibilities. A substantial collection of sexually explicit frescoes, mosaics, and objects, entirely ordinary within the context of ancient Roman decorative and religious practice, were removed from public excavation sites and locked away in a restricted, secret cabinet at the Naples Museum, accessible only to men of supposedly appropriate age and moral standing, a restriction that remained partially in place, remarkably, well into the 20th century. This selective, morally filtered presentation of Pompeii to the wider public reveals as much about the changing attitudes of the centuries since the excavation as it does about the ancient Romans themselves. Modern archaeologists and museum curators now present this same material far more openly as simply one authentic, unremarkable part of ordinary Roman visual culture, neither more shocking nor more significant than any other aspect of the town's rich, thoroughly excavated daily life. Pompeii has continued shaping popular culture well into the modern era, inspiring countless novels, paintings, films, and even opera, its story serving as a recurring, powerful symbol for the fragility of civilization and the way disaster can preserve, as much as destroy, a genuine, permanent record of a single, ordinary human moment. Chapter 27. Pompeii's own wine bars and street food culture. Returning once more to the town's everyday commercial life, Pompeii's dozens of thermopolia, the small counter-service food and drink shops mentioned earlier, deserve a closer look, since they reveal so much about how ordinary Romans without their own kitchens actually ate day to day. Many ordinary Pompeians, particularly those living in cramped upper-story apartments without proper cooking facilities of their own, relied heavily on these street corner establishments for hot meals, much like a modern city dweller might rely on nearby takeout restaurants rather than cooking every meal at home in a small, poorly equipped apartment kitchen. Archaeologists studying food residue within these thermopolia counters have identified a genuinely varied ancient fast food menu, including duck, goat, fish, and snails, seasoned with the ubiquitous garum fish sauce, along with wine, served both plain and mixed with honey or spices, depending on the establishment, and the customer's own taste and budget. These small shops also functioned as informal social hubs within their immediate neighborhoods, much like a modern corner bar or coffee shop, where regular customers might exchange news, conduct minor business, or simply pass time. Their painted decorations and cheerful, often food-themed artwork suggesting genuine pride in these modest, ordinary establishments, despite their relatively humble place within Pompeii's wider social hierarchy. Chapter 28: Vesuvius Since. Mount Vesuvius has erupted numerous times since 79 CE, though never again with quite the same catastrophic combination of surprise and scale that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum. Its most recent major eruption came in 1944 during the Second World War, causing significant damage to nearby towns, and even, according to some accounts, briefly disrupting Allied military aircraft operations in the region. Vesuvius remains an actively monitored volcano today, with modern seismological and geological equipment tracking its activity continuously. And it's now widely considered one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world, not because of any unusual geological ferocity compared to other volcanoes, but simply because of the sheer number of people, over 3 million today, living in the immediately surrounding metropolitan Naples area. Modern emergency planners have developed detailed evacuation strategies for the region, drawing directly on the lessons of 79 CE. The ash and pyroclastic flow patterns Pliny the Younger described so carefully nearly 2,000 years ago remain genuinely relevant, practical data for volcanologists and civil planners working to protect the millions of people now living in the same shadow that once fell over Pompeii. Italian authorities have designated a red zone around Vesuvius, encompassing dozens of towns and cities, where a full evacuation would be required well before any eruption actually began, based on the kind of precursor seismic activity that, unlike in 79 CE, modern monitoring equipment can now detect and interpret with genuine scientific confidence, giving today's much larger population a chance the ancient residents of Pompeii and Herculaneum simply never had. The Vesuvius Observatory, founded in 1841 and still operating today as one of the world's oldest continuously running volcano observatories, maintains a dense network of seismic, ground deformation, and gas monitoring instruments across the mountain, providing continuous, real-time data that would have seemed like genuine magic to Pliny the Younger. Watching the same mountain's behavior with nothing more than careful, unaided observation nearly 2,000 years earlier. Financial incentive programs have even been introduced in recent years, offering residents of the most dangerous red zone areas payments to voluntarily relocate away from the volcano's most immediate danger zone. A genuinely modern approach to disaster risk reduction that recognizes, honestly, how difficult it remains to convince people to leave homes, communities, and livelihoods behind, even when the underlying geological danger is well understood and clearly documented by scientists. Despite this modern monitoring capability, evacuating a densely populated modern metropolitan area of several million people remains a genuinely difficult logistical challenge, one that emergency planners continue refining and rehearsing, fully aware that Vesuvius, though currently dormant, remains geologically active and will, at some unknown point in the future, erupt again. Chapter 29: The Wider Bay of Naples Disaster. Pompeii and Herculaneum, though the most famous casualties of the 79 CE eruption, weren't the only communities destroyed that day. The smaller towns of Oplontes and Stabii, along with numerous scattered villas and farms across the Bay of Naples region, were also buried beneath the same volcanic material, each preserving its own distinct archaeological story. Oplontes, in particular, has yielded one of the most luxurious surviving Roman villas anywhere in the ancient world, a grand seaside residence traditionally associated with Poppaea Sabina, the second wife of the Emperor Nero. Its enormous scale and lavish decoration suggesting ownership at the very highest levels of Roman imperial society, even though direct documentary proof of this specific attribution remains, like much about the site, somewhat uncertain. Stabii, where Pliny the Elder met his own death attempting to organize a rescue, has revealed several grand villas built specifically to take advantage of the town's elevated, scenic coastal position, popular as a fashionable retreat for wealthy Romans seeking relief from the summer heat. Their excavated remains offering yet another window into how the Roman elite chose to spend their leisure time in the decades before the disaster arrived. Taken together, these sites across the wider Bay of Naples region give archaeologists an unusually complete, geographically varied picture of Roman life in 79 CE. From Pompeii's bustling ordinary commerce to Oplontes and Stabii's more rarefied aristocratic leisure, all preserved by the same single, catastrophic natural event that struck the entire region within the same terrible day and a half. Chapter 30: Volcanoes, Belief, and the Search for Meaning. Ancient Romans, lacking any scientific understanding of volcanism, naturally reached for religious and mythological explanations to make sense of what had happened at Vesuvius, weaving the disaster into their existing framework of divine anger cosmic upheaval, and mythological memory. Some ancient writers connected the eruption to the mythological giant Typhon, said in Greek and Roman tradition to lie trapped beneath volcanic mountains. His struggles against his imprisonment, explaining the rumbling, fire, and smoke that volcanoes periodically produced, a mythological framework that had already been applied to Mount Etna in Sicily centuries earlier, and was naturally extended to explain Vesuvius's own sudden, terrifying awakening. The god Vulcan himself, patron of fire and metalworking, and the clear namesake of the modern word volcano, held particular religious significance in the region surrounding Vesuvius, and some later writers interpreted the eruption as a manifestation of the god's own forge and fire bursting forth from beneath the earth. A comprehensible explanation within the Romans' own religious framework, however far removed from the actual geological processes modern volcanology would eventually uncover many centuries later. This search for meaning wasn't purely mythological either. The earlier mentioned philosopher Seneca's careful natural philosophical writings on the 62 CE earthquake represent a genuine, if ultimately mistaken, ancient attempt to explain seismic and volcanic activity through observation and reasoned argument rather than myth alone. An early, imperfect ancestor of the modern scientific approach that would, many centuries later, finally explain what had actually happened to Pompeii that terrible day. Chapter 31: What Remains. Pompeii endures today as one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world, drawing millions of visitors annually to walk the same paved streets, stand in the same painted rooms, and see the same plaster-cast final moments that the eruption of 79 CE created almost by accident, preserving in catastrophe what time and ordinary decay would otherwise have long since erased. Excavation continues at the site even now, with roughly a third of the ancient town still unexcavated beneath the earth, meaning new discoveries, new frescoes, new everyday objects, and new insights into this single, terrible, perfectly preserved day continue emerging regularly, even nearly 2,000 years after the eruption itself. Recent excavations, using increasingly careful, slow, and non-destructive modern archaeological methods rather than the faster, more damaging techniques of earlier centuries, have continued yielding remarkable new finds well into the 21st century, including a beautifully preserved thermopolium food counter with its painted decorations still vividly colored, and additional plaster casts capturing new individual victims' final moments, each discovery adding another small, specific detail to a picture that, remarkably, is still being completed nearly 2 millennia later. One especially well-publicized recent excavation, completed in the final years of the 2010s, uncovered a small, richly decorated thermopolium counter painted with images of the specific animals whose meat was likely sold there, along with traces of actual food residue still detectable within the counter's built-in serving containers, giving researchers direct, physical evidence of exactly what a Pompeian fast food customer might have eaten on any ordinary day before the eruption. Excavators working this same unexcavated region of the town have also continued uncovering additional victims. Their careful, methodical work, using increasingly refined techniques designed to preserve as much scientific information as possible, treating each new discovery not merely as an artifact to display, but as a genuine, individual human story, deserving careful, respectful documentation before any casting or removal takes place. This same recently excavated region has also produced richly decorated rooms and previously unknown frescoes depicting mythological scenes, adding fresh material to art historians' already substantial catalog of Pompeian painting, and confirming that even after roughly 2.5 centuries of continuous excavation, the site still holds genuine surprises for anyone patient enough to keep looking carefully. Modern conservation efforts at Pompeii also face a genuine, ongoing challenge, quite separate from new excavation. Exposure to open air, weather, and millions of annual visitors has caused real deterioration to previously excavated areas over the past 2 centuries, leading UNESCO and Italian heritage authorities to invest heavily in recent decades in careful conservation and restoration work, protecting what has already been uncovered, even as new sections of the buried town continue slowly emerging from beneath the ash. Major, well-funded conservation initiative launched in the 2010s specifically targeted decades of accumulated structural damage and deferred maintenance across the site, addressing collapsed walls, deteriorating frescoes, and drainage problems that had genuinely threatened parts of the excavated town. A large-scale, sustained investment reflecting recognition that simply excavating Pompeii was never enough on its own. Protecting what had already been uncovered required its own dedicated, ongoing commitment, every bit as serious as the original excavation work itself. Some archaeologists and heritage experts have even argued that a portion of Pompeii's still buried 2/3 should perhaps remain deliberately unexcavated for now, preserved safely beneath protective ash for future generations of archaeologists, equipped with better tools, more advanced non-destructive scanning technology, and more refined conservation techniques than exist even today. A genuinely patient, long-term perspective on a site that has already, after all, waited nearly 2,000 years to tell its story. Perhaps that's the quietest, strangest lesson in tonight's story. That a disaster terrible enough to end an entire town in a single day also became the very thing that preserved it, protecting an ordinary Tuesday morning, essentially unchanged for the better part of 2,000 years, until it could finally be uncovered again, and quietly, carefully, given back its story. Nothing about that ordinary morning asked to be remembered this vividly, this completely. And yet here we are, still visiting it, still walking its streets, still reading its walls, nearly 2,000 years later, simply because the mountain beside it happened to keep it safe in its own terrible way, for far longer than anyone could have ever intended. Think back for a moment across everything that's passed through this story tonight. Bread still sitting in an oven, a dog straining uselessly against its chain, a family huddled together in a final embrace, a fleet commander sailing toward danger instead of away from it, and an entire ordinary town, mid-sentence in its own daily life, suddenly and completely stopped, only to be carefully, patiently given its voice back, centuries later, by people who finally learned how to listen. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. Let the ash and the mountain and the quiet, interrupted town fade gently now. Let your thoughts loosen and drift and settle. If this story helped you rest, a like, a subscribe, or a follow, wherever you're listening, helps it find someone else who needs a little help falling asleep too. But that's a thought for tomorrow, not tonight. Whatever tomorrow holds can wait quietly until morning, the same patient way this whole long story has already unfolded tonight. One layer of ash, one quiet room, one careful discovery at a time. Nothing more to carry forward tonight. No more mountains, no more falling ash, no more streets to walk through in the dark. Just this quiet room exactly as it is right now, and the soft, settling silence, patient and unhurried, the same as that mountain has always been. Rest now slowly, the way an ordinary afternoon might quietly turn to evening. Nothing urgent, nothing left to finish tonight. Only this soft, steady quiet, asking nothing of you at all. Let go completely, one breath at a time. You're exactly where you need to be, and there's nothing left to hold on to except this rest, this stillness, this quiet, dark room around you. For now, just rest. Let go of the ash and the mountain and the long, quiet centuries behind them. You're safe, you're comfortable, and there's nowhere else you need to be right now. Somewhere tonight, quietly, that same mountain still stands over the same bay, green and forested again, watched constantly now by careful instruments that would have seemed like magic to the people who once lived in its shadow without ever knowing its true name. Let that image rest with you for a moment. A quiet green mountain over a quiet dark bay, patient and unhurried, holding its long, sleeping silence for however many years it chooses to hold it, the same as it always has. Picture one last time that ordinary morning market long ago. Bread cooling on a counter, a merchant calling out prices, a dog dozing in a patch of shade. Nothing at all unusual about any of it. And let that quiet, ordinary scene be the last thing your mind holds onto tonight, before everything else quietly fades. There's nothing left to remember, nothing left to follow, only this soft, comfortable stillness and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing, carrying you gently the rest of the way down into sleep. Let your breathing slow, gently, on its own. There's no more history to follow now, no more mountains, no more distant streets to walk. Just this quiet room, this quiet moment, and the soft, steady dark settling in around you. Sleep now. Drift all the way down. You've earned this rest, and it will still be here, waiting for as long as you need it. Good night, and sleep well.